Carl Jung once uncovered a psychological transformation so profound and unsettling that he considered it among the most disturbing developments he'd ever encountered in his clinical career. This wasn't a singular event. It was a repeating phenomenon he witnessed in patient after patient, especially those we now refer to as empaths. These individuals often arrived in his clinic appearing delicate, worn down by life, and almost invisible in their own stories. But something remarkable and terrifying happened over time. Beneath their gentleness lay an unrecognized force. When pushed to their emotional edge, they didn't break. They woke up. Jung eventually identified them as what we might call awakened empaths, individuals who had unconsciously studied the very forces that had once tried to destroy them. Their transformation wasn't random or chaotic. It was a precise shift, a moment of psychological ignition that forever altered the way they engaged with the world. He had observed that many of these empaths had spent a lifetime being emotionally dismantled by the very people who were supposed to care for them: parents, partners, friends. They came to therapy blaming themselves for their suffering, apologizing for their existence, and questioning their own sanity. These were people who had normalized abuse. They believed the pain was their fault. They excused the bruises. They rationalized betrayal. And worst of all, they silenced their own perceptions because the world told them they were too sensitive. What Jung discovered shook him to the core. These patients were not passive victims. Beneath the years of self-doubt and silence, they had been observing with astonishing accuracy. Their minds had become emotional repositories, filled with the data of their abusers' behaviors, patterns of manipulation, unspoken insecurities, emotional cycles. They hadn't just survived trauma. They had mapped it. He realized they had been operating like emotional cartographers, mapping out the psychological terrain around them without even knowing it. They knew what made others tick. They could predict emotional storms before they happened. They had kept all this inside, not out of fear, but out of restraint. And when the snapping point came, usually triggered by an ultimate betrayal, they didn't erupt in chaos like others might expect. They didn't scream, cry, or plead. Instead, something far more unsettling occurred. They became clear, unshakably, unnervingly clear. Jung described this shift as the moment when emotion and logic fused, when the empath finally stopped internalizing harm and began externalizing truth. This wasn't an act of vengeance, it was an act of vision. These empaths had been gathering insights like intelligence officers. Now, they were finally putting that knowledge into words, not to hurt, but to reveal. With a level of calm that sent chills down Jung's spine, they began confronting dysfunction with clinical precision. Not to punish, to clarify. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't seek approval. They simply spoke truth. And the truth, Jung noted, was devastatingly accurate. As Jung continued working with these deeply intuitive patients, he began to unravel a pattern so precise, so unnerving, it would redefine his understanding of human cognition. What the world labeled as overly emotional or too sensitive, Jung saw as high-level data processing, emotional pattern recognition, functioning at an advanced, nearly unconscious level. These empaths weren't fragile. They were neurologically sharp. Every tear they had shed had been a data point. Every moment of silence had been a calculation. Every so-called breakdown was actually the brain silently cataloging truth. Jung realized that these people didn't just feel more deeply, they perceived more completely. Their emotional sensitivity was not a flaw, but a form of intelligence society had never learned to recognize, let alone respect. It wasn't magic. It was mindfulness paired with trauma, hyper-awareness forged under emotional fire. In a series of quiet but groundbreaking experiments, Jung began inviting colleagues to interact with his empathic patients without providing any prior context or background. What happened next startled even the most skeptical observers. Within a few minutes of basic conversation, the empaths could detect deep-seated childhood wounds, unresolved relational patterns, and professional anxieties, often with startling specificity. And they weren't guessing. They were watching, listening, sensing. They were scanning every facial tick, every pause, every emotional inconsistency, and unconsciously matching them with behavioral patterns they had seen hundreds of times before. Their intuition was really finely honed analysis. Jung noted that their accuracy wasn't anecdotal. It was measurable frequently, over 95%. That's when he realized something truly profound. These empaths had been gaslit by society into believing their gifts were defects. They were never too emotional. They were emotionally fluent. They weren't unstable, they were unfiltered. But over time, that suppression took its toll. For years, these individuals had been told to shrink themselves to ignore what they saw, to disbelieve what they felt, to tolerate what they instinctively knew was wrong. The cost of fitting in had been silence. But silence is not the same as ignorance. These empaths had absorbed and internalized more than anyone realized. And then came what Jung called the clarity event. This event, always triggered by betrayal, didn't lead to chaos. It led to control. It wasn't rage that erupted. It was awareness, a kind of quiet, focused lucidity that unnerved everyone around them. The empath didn't explode. They evolved. What truly unsettled Jung was the permanence of this transformation. These people didn't return to their previous selves. They didn't slip back into old roles or relationships. Once they integrated their shadow, the parts of themselves they had long been told to hide, they became whole. Not perfect, not immune to pain, but complete in a way that made manipulation impossible. One case, in particular, stood out to Jung. A man who had spent decades appeasing a critical, domineering mother. He had married a woman who mirrored her traits: emotionally cold, dismissive, impossible to please. For years, he rationalized her behavior, blamed himself, and bent over backwards to be enough. But after discovering a hidden betrayal, one he had sensed but ignored, he didn't fall apart. He calmly laid out every instance of emotional abuse, financial deceit, and betrayal, with timestamps, receipts, and clarity. He walked away with no drama, only decisiveness. Jung understood then that what he was witnessing wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. As Jung continued his deep dive into these cases, he began to see an unmistakable psychological evolution taking place, an internal awakening that no longer resembled traditional therapy progress. These empaths, once silenced by fear and conditioned to doubt themselves, were undergoing transformations so complete they redefined what psychological recovery could look like. This wasn't healing in the conventional sense. It was ascension, emotional and cognitive self-realization at its highest level. The catalyst was always the same: betrayal. But not just any betrayal. It had to come from someone the empath had trusted completely. Someone they had protected, defended, and often loved unconditionally. It was that specific betrayal, by the very person they had given the most to, that finally ignited the internal shift. Jung noted that the pain wasn't just from the action. It was from the realization that the empath had seen the signs all along and chosen to ignore them. This self-betrayal, this denial of intuition, was the real heartbreak. What followed was the clarity event, but this wasn't a dramatic outburst or emotional eruption. It was a quiet click in the psyche, a moment where the empath's brain aligned with their heart and simply said, "No more." And once that internal alignment occurred, their entire perspective shifted. They stopped hoping people would change. They stopped negotiating with dysfunction. They stopped explaining what they knew deep down wasn't theirs to fix. Instead of reacting emotionally, they started responding strategically. Jung described this transition as the fusion of two previously divided forces: analytical cognition and emotional intelligence. Empaths had long possessed both, but social conditioning had trained them to suppress one in favor of being palatable, of not rocking the boat. But once awakened, they no longer cared about being digestible to others. They cared about truth. These empaths began confronting long-standing lies and illusions, not with anger, but with surgical clarity. They didn't yell. They didn't plead. They revealed, calmly, unshakably, as if every suppressed insight had been patiently waiting its turn to be spoken aloud. Their abusers weren't met with chaos, but with facts, with timelines, with patterns, with unfiltered truth. Jung likened their communication style post-awakening to that of a seasoned surgeon. They didn't seek revenge. They sought exposure. They identified every disease dynamic, every manipulative tactic, every covert power play, and they laid it all bare, piece by piece, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. They weren't burning bridges, they were cutting cords. And what shook Jung the most was that these empaths didn't look back. They didn't return to the toxic family members, the abusive partners, the draining friendships. They didn't reopen doors once closed. Once they saw clearly, they moved forward without guilt. This wasn't a temporary boundary. It was a psychological rebirth, a new identity. Jung coined a term for what these individuals became: selectively empathetic, still capable of deep compassion, but now armed with discernment, Their empathy was no longer universal, it was earned. No longer weaponized against them, it was shielded. They weren't hardened, they were fortified, and the world felt the difference. Jung observed how people who once manipulated them now felt visibly uneasy in their presence. Not because these empaths were threatening, but because something intangible had changed. The manipulative could sense it the way a predator senses danger. There was no more access, no more control. The game was over. Jung wrote that the presence of these transformed empaths had a ripple effect, not just within their personal lives, but throughout every environment they entered. Their shift from unconscious absorption to conscious clarity didn't go unnoticed. Entire family systems began to crumble, not because the empaths attacked them, but because they stopped enabling dysfunction. They were no longer willing to play the silent role that held the toxicity together, and that alone was enough to collapse everything built on emotional exploitation. Alcoholic parents, once shielded by their empathic children's quiet forgiveness, were suddenly faced with the truth of their own behaviors. Manipulative siblings lost their favorite scapegoat. Emotionally dependent partners realized that their usual tactics, guilt, gaslighting, deflection no longer had an effect. It was as if the empath's transformation turned them into a mirror. And in that mirror, people saw themselves clearly for the first time. Some evolved, many recoiled. Jung called this phenomenon the empath's mirror effect. The awakened empath no longer had to say anything or prove anything. Their very presence disrupted the lies others had lived comfortably within. They had become walking truth detectors, not through confrontation, but through energy. And while manipulative people shrank from that energy, the authentic ones gravitated toward it. For the first time, safe people felt truly safe with them, because now, the empath wasn't just open-hearted. They were open-eyed. They could offer love without losing themselves. They could nurture others without draining their own reserves. They could hold space without becoming a dumping ground. Jung marveled at how this transformation also unlocked a kind of intuitive mastery. These empaths didn't just see surface behaviors, they saw root causes. When Jung introduced them to other patients without disclosing any background, many were able to accurately identify core psychological wounds, sometimes down to the exact childhood events that had shaped them. Even more startling was their ability to intuit the specific form of therapy the individual needed. This diagnostic precision surpassed anything Jung had seen in his years of training. It was more than intuition. It was synthesis, the merging of analytical insight and emotional intelligence into something he described as psychological genius. And yet, what kept him up at night wasn't the brilliance of it. It was the ethical implications. Because here was the truth Jung couldn't ignore. If this power could be used for healing, it could just as easily be weaponized. He began to wonder, what happens if someone figures out how to intentionally trigger this transformation? What if someone learns to push empaths to their breaking point on purpose? Not for their benefit, but to harness their clarity, their insight, their strategic mind. It was a question that both fascinated and frightened him. To protect the integrity of his findings, Jung never published the complete framework during his lifetime. He scattered his notes across journals, locked case files, and unpublished manuscripts. But the pattern was clear. These transformations weren't anomalies. They were blueprints, predictable, replicable, and if mishandled, dangerously exploitable. So Jung developed what he called ethical integration protocols, methods, to help awakened empaths stay grounded in compassion even as they gained unprecedented psychological power. He believed the key wasn't to suppress the shadow, but to integrate it with ethics and awareness. Only then could empaths become what he saw as the future of human psychological evolution. Jung began outlining a process he eventually called the Integration Observation Protocol, a framework that described how empaths naturally transitioned from unconscious pain absorption to conscious strategic awareness. This wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It wasn't about symptom reduction. It was about transformation, deep, cellular, identity-level change. Through extensive observation, Jung noticed that this process often unfolded in 3 distinct stages. The first stage he called recognition. In this phase, empaths began to identify the disowned parts of themselves, the shadow elements they had been conditioned to suppress. But here's where it gets fascinating. Their shadow wasn't filled with malice or cruelty. It was filled with suppressed intelligence, repressed discernment, and unacknowledged strength. For years, they had downplayed their insights in favor of being liked. They had swallowed their truths in the name of peace. But in the recognition stage, that suppression broke. These individuals began to trust what they saw, heard, and felt without asking for permission. They stopped saying, "Maybe I'm overthinking," and started realizing, "No, I'm seeing clearly." The second stage Jung termed integration. This was the most intense part of the process. Empaths didn't just reclaim their lost voice, they merged it with their already vast emotional landscape. They learned to balance compassion with discernment. They embraced not only their nurturing sides, but also their ability to walk away, to say no, to confront falsehood with clarity. They became, as Jung described, complete selves individuals who could offer deep kindness where it was earned and unwavering boundaries where it was not. It wasn't a binary switch from soft to hard. It was a merging heart and mind, intuition and logic, love and limits. The third stage was what Jung found most astonishing. He called it application. Here, the integrated empath learned to use their emotional intelligence not just defensively, but deliberately. They became what Jung described as psychological architects, people who could walk into a room and immediately sense the emotional layout, identify hidden dysfunctions, and know how to either repair the foundation or walk away before being buried under it. These individuals didn't just stop being manipulated, they became unmanipulatable. They could spot emotional games from miles away, neutralize them before they began, and continue with grace and calm. It wasn't that they became cold, quite the opposite. They remained deeply loving. But now, their love was strategic, reserved for those who honored it, not those who demanded or exploited it. Jung's private reflections revealed a sense of awe. "I have witnessed," he wrote, "the birth of a new psychological force, compassion paired with clarity, intuition guided by will, empathy with armor." But what moved him most was this: these transformed empaths weren't seeking revenge or validation. They didn't want to prove anything to anyone. They simply wanted to live in peace, on their own terms, without being drained, diminished, or deceived. Their transformation was not about becoming someone else. It was about becoming who they had always been before the guilt, before the gaslighting, before the emotional training to shrink. As Jung's observations deepened, he became more convinced that these empathic transformations weren't merely personal breakthroughs. They were evolutionary milestones. What he had documented was not a psychological anomaly. It was a template for the next stage of human development. These individuals, once dismissed as fragile or overly sensitive, emerged from their integration as powerful forces of clarity and influence. They thrived in areas where emotional intelligence mattered most: business, relationships, leadership, therapy. Jung followed several of his patients long after their transformation and documented remarkable shifts in their lives. In their careers, they excelled. Clients trusted them instinctively. Colleagues were drawn to their calm, grounded energy. They became problem solvers, conflict navigators, and advisors not because they sought control, but because they could see what others couldn't. Their decisions were swift, accurate, and often ahead of their time. They had learned to trust their intuitive radar with total confidence. In their relationships, they flourished, no longer mistaking red flags for potential. They quickly identified manipulative behaviors and disengaged early. But more than that, they attracted emotionally healthy people. People who appreciated their clarity, not feared it. People who didn't mistake kindness for weakness. Jung noted that for the first time in their lives, these empaths experienced mutuality love based not on obligation or rescue, but on equal energy exchange. Their personal boundaries, once porous and inconsistent, had become crystalline, not rigid, but unyielding where it mattered. They didn't need to shout no, they embodied it, and people felt it, the kind of boundary that doesn't provoke argument, because it radiates certainty. Jung referred to this as energetic authority, a presence that quietly commands respect without demanding it. What made Jung both hopeful and uneasy was the restraint these empaths chose to exercise. After enduring years, even decades of exploitation, they could have used their gifts destructively. They could have emotionally dismantled their abusers with pinpoint accuracy, but they didn't. Instead, they walked away. No drama, no destruction, just distance. This choice, Jung believed, was the most important marker of their transformation. Ethical power. They didn't need revenge to feel powerful. They had reclaimed their autonomy, and that was enough. He began to wonder what would happen if more empaths reached this state? What if, instead of being pathologized, they were trained, guided through ethical integration, emotional discernment, and strategic communication? What if schools taught emotional intelligence alongside math? What if therapy focused not only on healing pain, but harnessing perception? Jung left these questions unanswered, but noted one final observation in his journal. These individuals have become what manipulators fear most people who see them completely and need nothing from them. It was the ultimate psychological immunity. They could walk into any space and detect dynamics instantly: who was lying, who was wounded, who was projecting. But instead of internalizing that information or trying to fix everyone, they simply chose where to engage and where to withdraw. Consciously, calmly, completely, their lives became less dramatic, but more meaningful. Fewer people, but deeper bonds. Fewer battles, but more victories. They no longer needed to be understood by everyone, just by themselves. And Jung saw this not as the end of therapy, but the beginning of something far greater. The birth of what he called the integrated empath, an individual who could feel everything, lose nothing, and choose everything with intention. Jung's final reflections on these cases carried a profound and sobering message. The empath's journey wasn't from sensitivity to numbness. It was from unconscious suffering to conscious sovereignty. These individuals didn't lose their empathy. They refined it. They became people who could still feel deeply, but now decided who and what was worthy of that depth. He called them balanced warriors capable of immense gentleness toward those who respected their energy, and unshakable firmness with those who didn't. They weren't trying to save everyone anymore. They were choosing who to stand beside. That, to Jung, was the essence of psychological maturity, choice, and perhaps most importantly, these empaths became guides for others. They didn't isolate in their strength. They returned to serve, whether as mentors, coaches, therapists, or simply as examples. They created ripples of emotional awakening everywhere they went. Their transformation inspired others to confront their own patterns. And in doing so, they disrupted generational dysfunction, not with force, but with presence. Jung's journals hinted at a quiet urgency. He feared what could happen if society continued to misunderstand the empath's power, or worse, deliberately suppress it. Because in the wrong systems, these gifts could be twisted into tools of control, but guided ethically. Awakened empaths could change everything: family systems, corporate cultures, even global leadership. His final insight echoes louder today than ever. Empaths aren't fragile. They're forged. They are not victims of their emotions. They are masters of perception, and once they stop doubting themselves, once they integrate their shadow and claim their truth, they become nearly untouchable. Not because they build walls, but because they radiate clarity. So if you've ever been told you're too sensitive, if you've felt the pull between kindness and boundaries, if you've sensed betrayal before it arrived, know this: you are not broken. You are awakening, and your power is not dangerous to the innocent. It is dangerous only to those who would use your compassion as a weapon against you. Choose conscious transformation. The world doesn't need more broken empaths. It needs more awakened ones. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that empower your inner transformation.